All right, well, everyone will get started. So welcome to our second Autism Awareness Month webinar. In the first webinar, we looked at how we could create an inclusive classroom by developing an inclusive curriculum, because sometimes the way that the curriculum is implemented in a school can be a barrier to learning. So we looked at in the first webinar. Today, we're going to continue our move towards universal design for learning by looking at how we can identify the strengths and functional impacts for students, the whole class in that tier one in the response to intervention model or multi-tiered system of support, and how we can do it for individual students at those higher levels. We talk about strengths first because we have a strengths focus of how we can support students, and we use the term functional impact because that really connects to the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability rather than barriers to learning, even though they're the same thing. So if we remember back to last session, one of the reasons this is important is knowing your learners, because in the nationally consistent collection of data, you can include students with disability who have a functional impact that the school supports, but it also allows schools to impute a disability. So they're not imputing a diagnosis of autism, because the federal government says we're not medical doctors. Once again, I joke, I'm not a real doctor, just wrote a really long essay, is we can impute the four categories of that nationally consistent collection of data: cognitive disability, social, emotional, physical, and sensory disability. But to do that, we have to rule out a lot of things first. And to be able to rule those things out, we actually need to know our learners really well. We need to know their strengths and we need to know their functional impacts or their barriers to learning. So we have to rule out learning difference. So if we've got a student who's hands-on and visual learner and a teacher talks at them all the time and a student struggles, you can't impute a disability. Once you've ruled those out, you need to rule out learning difficulty. Students come from EALD backgrounds, school absenteeism, family circumstance, national disaster like COVID, and poor teaching. And when we talk about categories like EALD, the risk with talking about categories is we miss the nuance within those groups. And so we need to go beyond labels and start to think about what are the strengths of the kids that we within those groups, and what are their functional impacts or the barriers to learning, so we can provide that targeted support. And then if a student still doesn't make progress over time, a school might consider imputing a disability. So when we talk about knowing our students' strengths and their functional impacts for all the kids we teach, we know that ATAL has the Australian Professional Standards for Teaching, and one of their professional standards or their professionologies, knowing students and how they learn. So when we look at this today, it really helps towards those professional standards. This is a really great quote from International Baccalaureate Education. It's that idea that when we think about kids as labels or categories, they don't provide a sound base to providing support and putting in place targeted strategies to support them. So because if let's hypothetically think about, if I talk about I have a student on the autism spectrum in my class, but that's all I talk about, the tendency is to go to a book, an educational text on autism that might have a list of strategies. But if all I know about that student is that a label, the tendency is to choose a random strategy out of that list of strategies from the book. And to be honest, the chances of that strategy actually working are like winning the lotto. And then because that doesn't often work, the teacher gets frustrated because it's in an academic text, it should work. And then I go and choose another one because the first one didn't work, and the chances of that not working are like working are like winning the lotto, and then I become even more frustrated. So labels really don't help much, because within those labels there is such diversity. As a man on the autism spectrum, my strengths and my functional impacts are very different to others. And so thinking about labels misses that nuance about the differences between individuals. So we're going to look at what we do today, what we do with schools to help them to kind of flesh that out a bit. So we looked a bit at the case model last session when we're looking at developing an inclusive curriculum. So the case model is I teach the content of the student's year level or age. Then I take into account their ability, so their strengths and their functional impacts. Then I assess along the achievement standards from prep to year 10 up and down. And then I evaluate how things go and I adjust as needed. When we're looking at the students' strengths and barriers to learning, it really helps with this A part of the case model. So the first session, we looked at the C part of the model and the S part of the model. Today, we're looking at the A around abilities of students. This is an interesting quote that has just come out in the new CARF, encouraging, so the curriculum assessment and reporting framework that the Department of Education in Queensland uses, and it is encouraging schools to establish a whole consistent school-wide approach to identifying barriers to learning for students. Because once again, if you think about kids as labels, you miss their strengths and you miss their barriers to learning, and then you often end up with generic approaches that often don't work. So it's about establishing processes that can be used to identify those barriers to learning, all those functional impacts coming from the nationally consistent collection of data. And we'll have a look at what we could do today. So when we talk about identifying students' strengths and barriers to learning, it is good to think about it within the response to intervention model or the multi-tiered system of support. So that tier one, we're talking about the whole class. We're talking about all the learners in the class. What are all those learners' strengths and barriers to learning? Then we start to become a bit more targeted in tier two, small groups, and tier three, individuals. But we have to start at that tier one, thinking about what are those strengths and barriers we see for a whole class so that we can then target our support. And when we look at Universal Design for Learning in the next webinar, we are talking about tier one. So it is really important to identify those strengths and identify those functional impacts, because that's where we start to target our pedagogy. Another way to look at this is at that tier one, we're looking at Universal Design for Learning. So we're thinking about all those learners, what are their strengths and what are their functional impacts or their barriers to learning. As we move into that tier two, those students are still receiving Universal Design for Learning. So that tier one really needs to be really solid, and it's only really solid if we know our kids' strengths and barriers to learning. Think about building a house. If you build a house on a really good foundation, it's going to be nice and solid. But if you don't build it on a good foundation, it's going to fall over. Same with the response to intervention model or the multi-tiered systems of support. It's because if you don't have that knowledge of the students' strengths and barriers at that tier one and target your pedagogy to support those strengths and overcome those barriers to learning, then our model will start to fall over. So at that tier two, students are still receiving access to Universal Design for Learning, but you'll have groups of kids getting differentiated instruction. And at that tier one, you'll see more of that differentiated instruction. But at each one of those levels, starting at tier one, moving into tier two and tier three, it is about knowing your learners' strengths and barriers to learning. So we're going to have a look to start with that tier one. So we're going to look at an approach that we use with schools at professional learning workshops and when we plan with teachers in classrooms. So what we do, we're thinking about quality differentiated teaching practice. And if you are familiar with the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability, this is taken from the levels of adjustment document, which talks about at that tier one, it's pedagogical practice that caters for the diverse needs of students. If we're going to cater for those diverse needs of students, we actually need to know them. We need to go beyond those labels. This is one on the definition of Universal Design for Learning from the nationally consistent collection of data that we looked at last session. Like the what we've just seen previously, it's about an approach that considers the needs of all learners from the beginning. So we actually need to know the needs of all our learners. So we need to know what are the strengths of our kids at that tier one and what are their functional impacts or barriers. So we use this simple model with teachers, to start to think about what are the strengths and the barriers that we see at that tier one. So rather than thinking about individual students, we get teachers to think about those groups of kids that they see in their class. And we get them to think about what are the common characteristics. Two that often come up when we do work with teachers is that varying levels of literacy and varying levels of engagement. Notice we use the term varying, because if I said low literacy or low levels of engagement, we automatically move into the negative. When we write varying levels of literacy and varying levels of engagement, it allows us to think, what are those strengths and what are those barriers to learning? So once we've come up with those common characteristics for groups of kids in our class, we then problem solve or identify what are those strengths within each one of those common characteristics that we see within our class. So for varying levels of literacy, we've got kids with excellent memory, we've got kids who are great with technology, we've got kids who are creative, and kids who have good visual literacy, because if I struggle to read, and then I'd probably have a better enhanced that visual literacy because I'm struggling to read. With kids with varying levels of engagement, I've got kids in my class who are creative, hands-on learners, hyper-focused when engaged, that they demonstrate leadership skills and are able to find creative shortcuts. So this is one that was created with a group of teachers at a workshop. So that will vary based on every class is different, every group of students is different. But notice when we talk about strengths, we're not saying students are nice and kind. When I see a personalized learning plan for a student and I see the strengths are that they're nice or kind or generous, that tells me the school doesn't really know that student, because those sort of strengths actually, and a kind of an assumption for everyone, but it also doesn't help me target a pedagogical response. But notice these strengths allow me to start to think about how I'll support the learners. If we stay in that common characteristic space of varying levels of literacy, that's very broad and it's hard to target a pedagogical response. But as we start to flesh out our student strengths and its functional impacts, it allows us to be more targeted with our pedagogy. So for our varying levels of literacy, in terms of barriers to learning, we might have kids who are low self-esteem, difficulties reading text, and so forth. And you can see what we've done now is we've moved from those common characteristics. We think about those groups of kids. What are the strengths we see in those kids? And then what are those barriers to learning or functional impacts that block them from accessing the learning process? So we would do this for a whole class because it helps us target our pedagogy at that tier 1. I'm very passionate about helping improve student outcomes as one, but also reducing teacher workload. I think over time, teachers have been required to do more and more. And I think around individual learning plans or personalized learning plans is a part of that. So let's have a look at what the nationally consistent collection of data says. Have a look at that second dot point. It says that a student might not have an individual learning plan. So a student with a disability who's receiving really good quality differentiated teaching practice might not have an individual learning plan. Because if you have an individual learning plan for every student with disability in a school, including those who have received quality differentiated teaching practice, you might be spending hours developing individual learning plans for students who just need that quality differentiated teaching practice. The nationally consistent collection of data requires us to identify students' needs, so we need to provide some sort of evidence of that. So rather than having an individual learning plan for a child receiving quality differentiated teaching practice, maybe we can go back to that document, and where we've got functional impacts, we think about the students with disability in our class and we put initials of those students next to those functional impacts to show that we've mapped out and we've identified what our students' needs are. Notice I've used student initials, I've just made these up. I haven't used full names. The reason I don't use full names is sometimes there's a risk of leaving a document open on a laptop or on a table or things like that, and someone reading it, and then you've got a breach of confidentiality. So initials allows you, for compliance purposes, to say I've identified a student's functional impacts, but it also overcomes those challenges associated with breaches of confidentiality. So that's how we would map out for a group of students at that tier 1, the strengths and the barriers to learning. And so at the next webinar, we're going to look at we're going to look at universal design for learning. Then we're going to look at how we can connect universal design for learning and associated strategies to those barriers to learning and those strengths. So, but some kids will need more than universal design for learning. So we can do the same process for individual students. And we'll look at tier 2 and tier 3 now. So we could do the same thing, but rather than for a group of students now, we actually just start to think about those individual students with disabilities. So a student with autism who might need more, we might do the same process, but for that individual. So we start with individual student characteristics and think about what are that we see of those students in our class, then moving to associated strengths and moving to those strengths, starting with strengths, because if we start with the functional impacts, there's a tendency to move into the negative very quickly, and we end up in this spiral of negativity. Then moving into what are their associated barriers to learning or functional impacts. Once again, these allow us to target our differentiated instruction strategies. One of the reasons this is important, and we're very passionate about reducing teacher workloads, is if we start with that tier 1 and do that for the whole class and then move into doing this for specific individuals, if we've identified barriers to learning or strengths for the whole class, we often don't need to come up with those twice, because we're going to address those in that tier 1 strategies. So it helps us to manage our workload a bit better, and we'll have a look at that in our next webinar. So what we've just looked at really helps the nationally consistent collection of data. So this is the individualized learning plan template from the federal government. My position has been, when I was in the classroom and a learning support teacher, is if the federal government is going to suggest something, I might as well use it, because then you know there's your defense. Why did I use this? Because the federal government suggested to. So down here at the bottom, overview of the student and their strengths. By doing that for the tier 1 and then for individual students, we can put those strengths into this nationally consistent collection of data individual learning plan. Then when we look at the next part, it's talking about what are the functional impacts of those students. And by doing this process around identifying them, it gives us really good data to put in there and say to the federal government, we really know the learner in front of us. So today's been a relatively quick webinar, because what I'd encourage you to do is go away and try this for your a group of students, or try it for an individual. So have a think about what 3 things you might try to commit to trying at your school or doing with your colleagues. I find that doing that process of having what are the common characteristics, what are the strengths, and what are the functional impacts, and doing that with a colleague and having that conversation makes it much easier, because you can ask questions and then flesh out some of their responses. Remember, I explained last time that if you're interested in the work that we create, Teachers Pay Teachers, everything is on there for free. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. We just loaded some more work up from today that we did with teachers. I'd encourage you to have a look at those resources, all totally free. Once again, here's a list of all our upcoming workshops moving forward. So please share these with your colleagues. If you like what you're seeing, share the video. I'll load it today and load it up to YouTube and then put it on our social media channels, and you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint. Once again, if you are interested in running professional learning at your school, but your budgets are tight, we offer a model where a school provides us a free venue and we give them at least 4 free tickets. We sell the rest via Eventbrite. We cover all expenses, no matter where you are located in Australia. And often, if we'll run the workshop and we don't sell any tickets, we'll still give the workshop to the school for free. So that might be something that you considered. If you're interested, please just send us an email, and please follow us on our social media pages. We publish everything. And I'll just see if anyone has any questions. I apologize, last time I didn't get a chance. So there are no questions today, but that's cool. If you have any questions moving forward, please email me with any questions you have.